The Secrets of Star Wars is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give.
I am Emily Swallow, also known as the Armorer on The Mandalorian. And I'm just giving a little shout out to the Secrets of Star Wars podcast because this is the way.
You're listening to The Secrets of Star Wars, episode 160.
Hello there.
It's a power that Jedi have that lets them control people and make things float.
Impressive. Every word in that sentence was wrong.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope.
This station is now the ultimate power in the universe.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
It's against my programming to impersonate a deity.
That's not how the Force works.
Force is with me, and I am with the Force, and I fear nothing.
Remember, the Force will be with you, always.
Hey everyone, I'm Angela Sealana, and you're listening to The Secrets of Star Wars, where we talk about everything connected to that galaxy far, far away. From movies to books to TV shows and more, we are looking at the deeper themes and meanings found in Star Wars, and we are going to have some fun doing that too. So today we are diving into The Bad Batch Season 2, Episode 12, entitled The Outpost. And I am joined today by someone who has had a bit of a hiatus from the show, but is happy to be back. Ryan Nafziger. Welcome back, Ryan.
Hello. I am happy to be back.
Yes, sir. And folks who've been listening for a while know that I call myself the Bendu. I've been just christening people the last couple of episodes. And I was like, Ryan, what do you think of the name the Pod Racer?
I think it is great.
So,
harkening back to my first experience with Star Wars, which was
exactly.
The Nintendo 64 game, Star Wars Pod Racer.
That's
great.
what I thought of. I think you brought that up like on your first few episodes on the show. So I was like, the Pod Racer. Why not? So here we are. We are talking about The Bad Batch. And of course, the last episode of the podcast was sort of our return to The Bad Batch. So we are going to continue that with this episode, The Outpost. The episode is summarized on StarWars.com as a new friend is made on a harsh and unforgiving outpost planet. So since some folks are choosing to watch The Bad Batch along with the podcast, we have decided to refrain from spoiler talk on these podcast episode reviews. So we're just going to be aware of where we all are in the viewing, just for context here. So Ryan, have you finished season 2 of The Bad Batch?
I have indeed finished season 2 as of this recording, but I will do my absolute best to make it seem like I haven't.
Well, I don't know about that for myself, but I have also finished season 2, but it's been a while. So I'm looking forward to these deep dives so that we can kind of finish the season here together on Secrets of Star Wars. And before we move on, just a brief moment to recognize and thank the people who make this podcast even possible, our fabulous patrons, including Greg C., Aaron M., Susan R., Trevor W., and Rosemary S. And you too can help StarQuest to continue our mission by becoming a patron at sqpn.com/give. All right, so this episode of The Bad Batch was, we were talking before the show, recording started, a dense one, as Ryan said. So Ryan, what is your overall first impression that you recall, or maybe just overall summary of what The Outpost sort of meant to you watching this episode?
So preface, this is my favorite episode of season 2.
All right.
So think here. The overall impressions that I got from this episode was I saw a very pronounced tone shift from the previous, I guess it would be the previous third or almost 3/4 of season 2. This episode seemed to really be a turning point into a more dense and dark time for the Batch and for Crosshair. So that sort of that summarizes my impressions and observations from this episode, though there are many more that we will undoubtedly be getting into.
Absolutely, yes. I think for myself, I would say that after watching this episode, I was a little bit stunned because of the intensity of the episode and what it gave us as far as Crosshair's character development and also his relationship to the Empire. And it was also moving to see, in that, it was moving to see Crosshair connect with a clone again.
Yeah.
On the level that he did. So that was sort of my overview of my takeaways from this episode. So let's really get into it, shall we?
Yeah.
So we begin by seeing almost like a foreshadowing. We see Imperial Captain Bragg escorting some clones into retirement, essentially. And these clones are kind of scoffing that they're being forced to retire. Of course, she just kind of brushes off their comments and tells them to talk to the Imperial Information Bureau for more information, like don't give me any of your comments or questions or whatever. So meanwhile, Crosshair is watching this. And to me, it's a great setup for the episode. So let's talk about, at this point in the season, what are your thoughts about Crosshair being caught in the middle of this era where we have sort of the clones versus the stormtroopers, and right there is Crosshair. I mean, fittingly, his name is Crosshair, right?
Yeah.
But he's in the middle of all of this.
Yeah. I think that in a lot of ways, Crosshair is kind of Crosshair is kind of the poster child for the clones that decided to stay with the Empire. Because one big theme with the Bad Batch so far as it has been the chips in the clones did not take away their free will. They did get a choice, and some have decided to leave. And I think Crosshair is kind of the way of looking at, what has life been like for all the clones that decided to stay, that decided this is my home, this is the only life I've known, I'm going to stick with it, even though, maybe I don't agree with everything, but good soldiers follow orders.
Right.
So I think this is kind of the a real like shift in that journey, where it seems that in this episode the clones are really definitively moved from being like a necessary but kind of aging part of the Empire to really just being a relic and not really being part of the Empire anymore. Kind of the same as, the old like battle droid tanks and the things that you see at the very beginning of the season, if you could think all the way back when they're scrounging up old tech and trying to make it work again. It's like the clones are kind of going the way of just war implements, and it's really sad.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Crosshair is sort of a complicated character, and I think that's why people enjoy his character so much. The fact that I think a lot of us also can sort of relate in a sense, because a lot of us have been in a situation where, whether it's, just a larger institution or even your job, where maybe the higher ups kind of go in a direction where you're like, I don't know if I'm really valuable here anymore, but I'm just going to stick around and try to do my job, because my job sort of helps me. Maybe it helps give you purpose or, a sense of direction. And in Crosshair's sense, it literally is what he was born and bred for, and now here he is in this situation where he's no longer wanted, really. I mean, they'll take him and they'll put him on this mission, but ultimately we will find at the end of this episode that it seems they want to do something else. And they know, they don't want someone who can think for themselves and be as dangerous as he is, right? So
yeah. And it's like the work that you see the clones doing is just becomes so menial. At the beginning, they were actually getting sent on, like, in fact, the second episode of this season, they were getting sent on important high profile missions to go in and infiltrate a keep or, the place that I forget exactly what it was, but now they're just guarding things. They're guarding things that seemingly don't matter anymore. So they're just being put on busy work. They're no longer of value, clearly.
Yeah, and actually in contrast to that, the rest of the Bad Batch has been exploring different ways of being in the universe and and trying to, sort of break out of their mold of being the typical soldier that they're used to. So there is this really direct contrast in the storyline between the two storylines, right?
Yeah. One they're finding more identity, they're moving beyond their past identity, and Crosshair's kind of just souring in his identity and is finding out that it's a dead end.
Well, this small scene was sort of a continuation of, our suspicions that Crosshair may not be just a good soldier who always follows orders, as he continuously repeats. And we meet Lieutenant Nolan, who is apparently voiced by Crispin Freeman. And if you're a fan of anime, you might recognize his voice or his name. He's done a lot of English dubbing work for anime series. So that's kind of interesting. He was a great villain, I thought.
I think so too. He's a good, I think he was a good, middling villain. I mean, I'm a big Hemlock fan. So.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
but I think that he did a good job as a middling villain, a sort of exalted middle manager.
Oh yeah, we definitely don't like him. So
yes, very easily hateable.
So it seems Lieutenant Nolan never misses an opportunity to note the smallest infraction of a clone, and we're informed that the mission is at an Imperial depot on Barton 4 to secure high-value cargo, quote unquote, from local insurgents. And apparently Lieutenant Nolan views clone troopers as used equipment, right? So going back to that whole theme of how they're viewed by the Empire, right? And hopefully not many of us have been on the receiving end of, essentially what were abusive, remarks. Definitely not helpful remarks at all from Lieutenant Nolan here. But, in reality, a lot of people find themselves in this kind of a situation where they have a superior like this. And again, going back to Crosshair repeating this mantra, good soldiers follow orders. Now we get to see in this particular episode whether he actually abides by that, because what if your orders are not good orders? What if your orders are like we see at the end, let's just cut to the chase, right? So I don't know, do you have any reflections on that, Ryan?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, I think in a lot of ways Crosshair has been trying to just tell himself that things are okay for a long time, and this is just the realization for him that things aren't okay, because clearly he's been having a lot of second thoughts over the course of most of the screen time that he's gotten since he separated from the Bad Batch, and he's been having to fight through all of that and pretty much lie to himself the whole time. And this is just where we see him stop lying to himself. And I think that that's really I think that this particular scene just not the scene, but the whole character interaction with him and Lieutenant Nolan just was a chance for him to just see all of those things he's been fighting against embodied, and then him decide to not care about that anymore at the very end.
Man.
So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I find it interesting that your expression of how Crosshair has been lying to himself, because I almost have been wondering if he has been lying to himself, or if he's just been sort of taking things in and making his own calculation as far as how important certain situations were in the grand scheme of things. So, like if you're in a situation where, for example, you have a really terrible boss, right? And who doesn't give people their human dignity, doesn't acknowledge that. As someone who is in that company or what have you, you have to assess, right? You have to assess the situation according to your conscience. And I think that's something that we can say that Crosshair has been doing, is that he has definitely been paying attention, because we've been seeing these little vignettes, right, of him kind of sitting and thinking about what he's been experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think he's been assessing, he's been following his conscience this whole time. And I think the cool part of the ending is, even though we may not agree with his choice, to basically kill somebody, we, in a way, it makes us want to root for him, I think, because he's starting to follow his conscience finally.
Yeah.
Again, whether or not his conscience is coming to a morally upright, decision is another conversation. But I don't know. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's hard because like, if Crosshair wasn't part of his if Crosshair wasn't part of the batch and part of and with his brothers and was there the entire time, I feel like I would have a lot more sympathy for him. But the hard thing that whenever I see scenes with Crosshair and like him being portrayed like really sympathetic, and I do have some sympathy for him, but it never passes me that he didn't just say yes to the Empire. He said no to his family too. And that's something that really we always seem to come back to it. For some reason, always at the end of a Bad Batch season, where he just has to, I don't know, he has to look himself in the eye and realize what he's done. In a way.
Man, I feel like a lot of people listening might be, this might be ringing some bells for people in terms of, like making a decision related to your family or your job or, whatever it is. So if you are having some thoughts you want to share with us, definitely send us some feedback. You can email us starwars@sqpn.com. As we continue, we finally get to Barton 4. And it is a planet that has an unforgiving, frigid, harsh climate. According to StarWars.com, the snow officer look that Lieutenant Nolan is sporting, I guess you could say, is actually a new design that takes inspiration from both the Republic and the Imperial snowtroopers, as well as the Imperial officer battle gear. So I thought that was just an interesting note here, because even though we're exploring territory that is previous sort of to a lot of things that we've already seen in Star Wars, we are still seeing some new designs happening, which is always interesting.
Yeah.
And so we meet the depot commander, Mayday, as well as Hex and Veach. And they're the sole survivors after more than a year on the job here at this depot. And Lieutenant Nolan, of course, scolds them for apparently doing a poor job of upholding their mission. But Mayday doesn't stand for that. And we get this short exchange where he tells Nolan that in his experience, respect has to be earned. And I've heard this phrase, so many times, I think we all have. From a Catholic perspective, I would say that's not the case because, we believe every person is made in the image and likeness of God, has a dignity that's comes from that. And therefore, every person is worthy of respect. I don't have to, necessarily, this is now I'm personally speaking here, but even if someone is not treating me in a way that is respectful, I still believe that I owe them a respect that they're not showing me. And honestly, it was interesting to watch Nolan and Mayday kind of go back and forth a little bit in this case, because I think their whole situation could have been made much easier if they had just been respectful toward each other. But I don't know. What do you think? Must respect be earned?
I mean, I think that the truth that Mayday is expressing is kind of he's more talking about trust, I think, than respect.
Okay.
Because I agree that absolutely respect, you're not, no one must earn someone else's respect, but trust is a bit different than that. And I think that Mayday is obviously extremely justified in not trusting Lieutenant Nolan and his orders and trusting that he has the best intentions in mind. All that is, I mean, it's pretty clear that Mayday doesn't trust him. And that is, I mean, you can absolutely respect someone and, treat them well without trusting them. In fact, it would be kind of ridiculous if that was not possible. So I'd like to make sure that that's brought in.
Oh, definitely. I appreciate that. And you could even go a little bit further and say that, Lieutenant Nolan, if he had been a practicing Catholic.
If Nolan was a Catholic, you need to go to confession.
So St. Augustine, he gives us this, I believe it's St. Augustine who says, we need to assume that people have the best of intentions. And that's part of charity. And obviously Nolan is not doing that. He's coming in and he's wanting to boss other people around and sort of use his position, his rank, as something that just is magically just earns everyone's respect and trust and all of that.
Yeah.
But he's not doing that. So that, I guess in the long run, that makes everything worse, I think, ultimately.
Yeah. And then it becomes clear halfway through the episode that he very clearly does not have the best intentions.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's made it manifestly clear that he does not care about anyone on that base beside himself.
Yeah. So Mayday, he's a really interesting character. He asks
best
the
facial
lieutenant
hair of any clone so far, might I add.
Oh, definitely. I think so. Yeah.
He's got it.
Right. But this personality he's got, he asks the lieutenant, right, how many missions have you commanded? And he gets the silence. And in a natural way, we kind of like that, we're just sort of like, that's satisfying on a certain level. Because it's like, oh, he really showed him. But, it also gives us a lot of insight into his personality. What was your impression of Commander Mayday overall, and why do you think Crosshair was able to connect with him over all the other people that he's been, working with thus far?
I think the reason why Crosshair happened to connect with Mayday is I think it was pretty clear that Mayday didn't have to prove anything. Crosshair seems to be the type of clone, kind of like Rex to a bigger extreme. Rex's mantra is experience outranks everything, but for Crosshair, it seems to be like experience is how I value you. But Mayday didn't have to prove any of that. He very obviously not only knew what to do, without having to, sit and take orders from Crosshair. He knew what to do. The two of them immediately worked well, but he also just all of what you needed to know about Mayday when we first saw him as like the audience was just shown on his clothing and on the helmets behind him. And I think that was how Crosshair really just took in, and the fact that that the two of them probably were feeling the exact same way. It's no secret that Crosshair feels like a piece of used equipment, and Mayday probably does too. And they probably felt just it wouldn't be hard for them to both immediately see the other and say, I understand what you're feeling.
Right. Yeah, it was definitely a level of honesty and authenticity that, as when you combine that with his experience, that's very obvious. That was the kind of person that Crosshair, I guess, connects with, because it's very similar to sort of the tone of the Bad Batch and how they operate right with each other.
Yeah, and kind of similar to how Crosshair seemed to relate to Cody. We don't know if Crosshair helped Cody escape or just turned a blind eye, but Crosshair definitely felt the same sort of respect for Cody, and the two of them also just immediately worked well together. He didn't have to explain what he was doing, like when back in season 1, when he was having to interact with the crack team of non-clones for the first time. There's just that immediate kinship because they're brothers.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mayday shows Crosshair around the outpost. They split up to combat some incoming raiders, and we get this moment where Crosshair looks through his scope in the midst of all the confusion, and then we see an explosion that seems to catch him off guard. He throws off his helmet. He makes these kind of grimaces and noises, as if he's sort of trying to fight off. To me, it looks like he's trying to fight off maybe an episode of PTSD because of the experience that he had in a previous episode where there was an explosion that really injured him. So how did you interpret that reaction that he had?
I interpreted it a bit differently. So I saw that he was zoomed all the way in on his thermal scope, and he probably just saw in a massive blinding flash that overloaded his already enhanced senses, his eyesight, which is kind of his part of his batch senses, the accurate thing that sets him apart. It just flooded his eyes, and it was just sensory overload. So he had to just get it off. It would be kind of like, if like Tech's earpieces just all of a sudden just got flooded with sound. That's how I read it. Though when you mentioned PTSD, it made me start thinking about the scene where he got severely burned by the Jedi cruiser's engines.
Yeah. No, I think it could definitely be a combination of both, because Crosshair is absolutely I was going to say a piece of work, but that just kind of underlines the wrong sort of tone.
Yeah.
That we're
maybe not
trying
that.
to go against here, but that he's really, I mean, he's been, I guess, enhanced, right? In his sensibilities in order to be, the best, assassin or sharpshooter. So yeah, I could totally see that. And so in this attack, both Veach and Hex die. And so that just leaves Mayday and Crosshair as far as clone troopers that are left. And of course that gives Lieutenant Nolan 2 targets, right? 2 people to boss around and blame everything on. And he sends them out to retrieve the missing crates. And so early on, they find a dead raider who is wearing armor stolen off the dead bodies of Mayday's own squad. And we get, I think, some foreshadowing as Mayday remarks, how upsetting it is to see this. And also disturbing that the dead raider's counterparts left him alone. And Crosshair says, well, there's no use in carrying dead weight. And Mayday says, remind me not to die on your watch. And as I was watching this episode for the second time, that really hit me. Wow. They really put it in there, huh? But almost immediately we get this, speaking of trust, we get a test of trust, right? So Crosshair steps on a mine and Mayday reminds him of what he just said about carrying dead weight. Oh, well, but as much as I would absolutely hate to step on a mine, I thought this whole situation was a really great addition to the story and to their relationship development. Were you nervous watching this? And what were you thinking as all of this was happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that they set it up and pulled it out of nowhere was really, really good because it immediately grabbed my attention and made me just freeze up, which is fantastic. I think that in my opinion, the best part of the scene and the part that definitely made me feel like Mayday and Crosshair just could get each other was when Mayday stepped around the corner before Crosshair stepped off the mine. What is it? Something is like not confident, just not stupid or something like that.
Right. Exactly.
Which was like, I think Crosshair's going to appreciate that one. Yeah.
Yeah. And also we got an interesting reflection on the Clone War and how Mayday was talking about, well, I never thought about what would happen after the war ended because I never thought about the war ending. But now, of course, I have to, and all of us have to kind of improvise now that the war's over. And he asked Crosshair, what unit were you with? And Crosshair has to think about Clone Force 99, and he says they're gone when Mayday asks him where they are. So I was just wondering if you had any not predictions, but any thoughts about what was going through Crosshair's mind at that time. I mean, I just wonder, how does he feel towards the Bad Batch at this time? If he's missing them, if he is kind of like good riddance, if it's a combination, like a mixture of a lot of things. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I think at this point, the last time he saw the Batch was the end of season 1. Is that right?
I'm trying to think if there was another mission that he was on that he saw them, but it's been a while since I've seen the first sort of half of the season.
I'd have to think about it, but I just don't think. I think that Crosshair is kind of in survival mode at this point, and it's just opening a fresh wound for him. He definitely think he's definitely just partitioned that part of him off and is trying to. I think he's just trying to live day to day. You know, when you go into survival mode, you just kind of put things off emotionally until you get out of what you're trying to deal with. And he probably doesn't know when what he's dealing with will end.
Yeah. Well, after Mayday saves Crosshair's life, they come to the camp of the Raiders, and it seems like they're not humans because they're vocalizing some sort of guttural noises. I was thinking probably they were also the creation of D. Bradley Baker, who voices the clones, because if you've ever seen an interview with D. Bradley Baker, or a panel discussion, he loves making weird noises. So I figured that was him.
An aside on the Raiders, I was watching, so I had already watched the episode once, and I was watching it again with a friend who hadn't, and she was convinced initially that they would be renegade clones or defective clones or something like that. So that was it was really interesting to see them just become faceless. And I think that actually worked really well in this context because it kind of would have brought too much in to be like processing for the narrative if they had been, you know, oh my gosh, they're renegade clones, or they were rebels and they were just trying to, you know, it kind of just takes away too much of the narrative. It becomes too convoluted there. But I thought they were really, really, really foreign.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. So Mayday and Crosshair kind of they do their thing, right? I mean, they they end up causing a whole lot of at least injury, I guess I should say. And they start to go load up some of that stolen cargo, and they see some in the snow and they realize that it's stormtrooper gear, it's TK gear. And that the Empire has been assigning clones to the depot because they're expendable. Even after, as Mayday says, you know, even after all that the clones have done for the Empire, he says, we're good soldiers, we followed orders, and for what? So, Ryan, what does that cargo and what it was, what kind of significance did that have for you watching this play out?
I mean, the big thing for me was just how you could see you didn't need an explanation on what was going on just by looking at the armor that Mayday was using. You know, everyone loves to look at the clone armor because it always looks so cool and it's always different every time, but this time was the most different because it was battered. They had to make do with what they had. He didn't have the proper snowtrooper armor either. They'd say several times, you'll freeze to death in this weather. Well, the reason why is they literally didn't have the gear that they were supposed to. And so this whole time they've been guarding just basic armor that what it showed was that they're just not valuable enough. They're literally less valuable than the clothes on their backs because if they were more valuable than the clothes on their backs, then they'd be wearing what they're trying to guard. And I think that was the biggest, heaviest hitting sort of visual from this episode, where it really just introduced sort of the end game of the, I guess you'd call it the clone phase out, the time between the end of the Empire and the beginning of Star Wars Episode 4, where clones are gone. And this is kind of the beginning of the end in a way. I felt like this particular scene was just really the beginning of the end. Because you know who wears that gear. You know that it's stormtroopers, it's TKs.
Yeah, 100%. It was pretty heartbreaking to see. And I think what helps with the emotional impact is that we don't get much time to really reflect on it, because almost immediately there's an avalanche that starts, and, you know, probably caused by the attack that they had to make on that base. So thus adding more to, sort of the tragedy of it. If they hadn't been sent out to accomplish this mission, then Mayday would have still, been alive. But so obviously Crosshair digs through the snow, finds that Mayday is seriously injured, and, physically unable to make it on his own. It's interesting that we had all this talk from Crosshair about there's no point in carrying dead weight. And then we get Crosshair endangering his own life to carry Mayday through the snowstorm, who is essentially a dead weight. So why do you think that there was this big change? Do you think the armor was sort of the last straw for him, for Crosshair, to really understand what was going on and to change his mind?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was for him just one of the moments in a long string of things in this episode where he's realizing that he was wrong and the Empire isn't all he has. His brothers are all that he has. Because the Empire doesn't care if he lives or dies. So I think that was the moment where he decided, and I hope that this pans out well, like in the future. But Crosshair's very clearly decided in this episode that his brothers are all he has, and that is what matters.
Right.
That's very clear in this scene.
Yeah. And also with the environment being what it was very intentional. The makers of the show have talked about in previous sort of content that we've gotten, whether it's an interview or something else, about how they're really intentional with regard to the environment that the episode takes place in. So to have Crosshair carrying Mayday through this snowstorm, in this, basically there's no warmth, right? So it's very much, I think, an analogy for how there is no warmth for the clones anymore on the part of the Empire, that they are on their own. And yeah, exactly. No one cares whether they live or die. So it's very frigid. And when you think about cold, extreme cold, because it could have been extreme hot weather too, right? But I think it was for that reason intentionally extreme cold, because they needed that spark of hope, of life, that they really just didn't have. It was sort of like seeing that cargo, when it was, that really sort of took the hope out of their futures in a way, for any future with the Empire. So finally they make it right to the depot as the cargo is being shipped out. And to me that was very poetic as well.
Yeah.
Because I mean the clones are being shipped out. Here comes the new TK gear being carefully shipped into the Imperial bases.
With the exact same amount of care they probably showed the clones, Same ships even,
Yeah.
It's just cargo. It's terrible.
And of course, the first person that we see is Lieutenant Nolan, who at the beginning of this episode, he spoke about the clones as being used equipment. Well, now we have some new equipment, right? That's being shipped into out from here, but into other Imperial bases. And so he gets his shiny new equipment, right? I mean, it's just heartbreaking to talk about. I mean, to kind of piece all this together is just wild how the writers really
they hammered it
underline
home.
this. And now we see Lieutenant Nolan essentially treating Mayday and Crosshair with a heartbreaking amount of contempt. He sees them struggling, he kicks them while they're down. And Mayday is literally on the ground, can get no lower. And I think that's also very poetic and intentional. Crosshair insists on Mayday getting a medic, but Nolan says that would be a waste of the Empire's resources. And at that point, Mayday dies. So Nolan tells them they're both expendable, and then tells Crosshair to get back to work while he's useful. So, yeah, how did this scene impact you, and what kind of things did you pull from this final scene here?
Yeah, I feel like they just cranked it up to 11. Really, I mean, they could have shown half of what they did for this particular scene, and it would have still made it enough. But man, they decided to hammer it home, and I think it in a way, you wanted Crosshair to pull the trigger the whole time. You're just waiting for him to. You're wondering why he didn't do it sooner. And I think that was so effective because it puts you into the perspective of how much Crosshair's probably endured over the course of his whole post Order 66 career. You know, he probably is just the whole time he's just getting, verbally beaten to death by Nolan. He's probably flashbacks. Probably someone's probably done an edit of this on YouTube, but all of the times that he has been treated like garbage, all the times. And I think it makes it so much more poignant when he snaps and just kills him.
Yeah.
It really, really shows that Crosshair has made his decision. He is not going to take this anymore.
Well, and listen, I mean, unfortunately, we're seeing some of that in real life. I mean, we're seeing a lot of people snapping in the Crosshair sense. And I'll just leave it at that. But I think it really can drive home the importance of, treating people with that respect, helping people out. I mean, we've got to support our fellow human beings, because there's some really terrible things can happen when people are sort of feel like they're being beaten down so much by, whether it's structures in society or their own just unfortunate situations. And I mean, life is hard, right? So when you have these kind of, when you're being treated in such a way, as Crosshair was, and as the clones are in this season and overall, we see, how it can affect somebody. And that's just, it really, for me, it hits home in on so many levels there. So I think ultimately, the clones are slaves to the Empire, and we see that in this particular scene. They're being treated as subhuman, nothing more than their utility. And we have that gorgeous shot of Crosshair next to Mayday's body, looking up to that snow vulture circling ahead of them. So what do you think that symbolizes? Because there's obviously some symbolism in that shot.
I think it was just showing how, I think the thing that I took away from all the recurring Snow Vulture theme was, I mean, the first thing I think of when I see like in media a scene of a vulture circling overhead is actually, in a desert, where you see someone struggling along and they're on their last legs and the vultures are just waiting for them to drop. And I think that we were being shown through this whole episode that this is the end of Crosshair's drudging on under the Empire. This is it, and this is where he's going to decide. And I originally, the first time I watched the episode, I didn't know if Crosshair was just going to die there,
Right?
Because that could have also been, shooting Lieutenant. I'm so
Nolan.
terrible with names. Thank you,
Yeah.
Nolan. Shooting Lieutenant Nolan and dying would have been, a more tragic conclusion, but could have still been like the same level of just impact. But I think that is definitely what I saw that Vulture is indicating. Like, this is the end of the Long March.
Wow. So Crosshair lives, but in a way, part of him dies.
Yeah. He dies. A lot of things die.
Yeah, to me, what I got from that Snow Vulture sort of circling over them is that Snow Vulture is acting as the Empire is treating the clones. It's just like waiting for them to die, basically, and to be of some other value to them if they can, if they can get any last bit of value, even, from their death. And so I think we see all of that, summed up in that scene. And then in Crosshair's mind, he makes that decision, right? He calls out Lieutenant Nolan and kills him. And when you see him do that, there's like so much pain in his face and his body. He's like, he's just wrapped in pain. And even the sound design, I noticed it sort of becomes more echoey. It's like when you just sort of check out mentally and everything just kind of is happening around you and you're less aware of it. That's what I interpreted the sound design as, just trying to communicate. And we hear these kind of like gasps coming from him, like he's just at the end of his rope and everything goes dark.
Yep.
So I thought that was the end of the episode.
Me too. I thought that that was the end, like that we would never see Crosshair alive again.
Yeah.
There it is. Then he wakes up.
And it's not over yet. He's in this clinical kind of environment and he's greeted by a female Kiwi accent similar to the clones, but it's not Omega. It's Emery Carr. And she was introduced earlier, I believe. I think they talked about her on the last podcast. She's apparently working for the Empire with Dr. Hemlock. And she tells Crosshair, cooperate and you might survive. As she's sticking him in the neck with this huge needle.
Yeah.
Cooperate and you might survive. That could be a slogan for the Empire, don't you think?
I think that that's probably the best Empire slogan that they've got so far. I think it fits really well with a lot of series we've seen.
Wow.
Cooperate and you might survive.
You might survive. So much hope in that slogan. No, not really. Not at all. Now, the identity of Emery Carr, it is revealed in the season to some degree. We won't go into that with, we don't want to spoil anything. But what do you think she's doing with Dr. Hemlock? I didn't think that's really something that's made clear. Do you have any theories about what she's doing with him in this sort of lab?
Yeah, that's something shockingly, I probably don't have any theories on this because I just don't know. She's so mysterious, and even after the conclusion of this season, she still remains extremely mysterious. She performs her work faithfully. You don't even know. I mean, I haven't even figured out if she's on board with the Empire.
Right.
To be honest, she's very much an enigmatic. She's just an enigmatic figure that's really interesting. Kind of the same way that Hemlock's interesting, because Hemlock is just aloof and in control all the time.
He is. And he's very enthusiastic, though, about what he's doing.
And he's voice acted extremely well. But in the same way, she seems very aloof and separated from everything that's going on around her. And that's
but she knows who Crosshair is.
Yeah, she knows who Crosshair is.
She not only knows his clone trooper number, but she also knows his nickname, which I thought was interesting. So it's kind of, it's also poetic that we saw that sort of death of part of Crosshair on Barton 4. And then after that death, he is in a lab where really he was born in the lab because he's a clone. So it's almost like the beginning of a new life in a way for Crosshair.
Yeah, I read it a bit differently. I read it in the same way that I read it as sort of like a cycle of life completion, where it's like he started in a lab and it looks like he's going to finish in a lab. And I think that was kind of, I think that that's where it's going, where this is terrible to say, but now they're going to take away Crosshair's identity, where he becomes a body for experiments. He is now a living body, and that is all. Yeah. And that's where I think things are really going to get dark in. Sure.
Man. Well, I tell you what, that was my initial takeaway from that. But as we've been talking, I've been thinking like, man, these writers are really like, they're really doing something here. And I think I want to say that, I think the lab I'll say it that way, it could signify the potentiality of a beginning of a new life for Crosshair if he wants it. I'll just leave it there. But
yeah.
Do you have any other final thoughts, Ryan, on this, your favorite episode in season 2?
Yeah. The thing that this episode made me think about the most is where is all of this leading to? Because they're taking the clones away. They have systematically destroyed every trace of this technology. They now have complete control over it, and they're just massing it and centralizing it. Are we going to see in the Bad Batch where this is all going to? And that's what I'm kind of I'm a bit scared for the Batch about, because it seems like this is all leading towards like a very like dark a conclusion that involves a lot of like just death. And I'm very concerned that as things conclude, we're going to see like a Rogue One-esque ending where the team doesn't make it out alive, but something else does. And I hope that doesn't happen. Fingers crossed.
Wow.
But
Yeah.
it really does seem like that's where things are going, because they're not pulling any punches with this so far.
But Ryan, it's a kids show.
It's Star Wars is a kids show, though.
Oh man, I tell you
Oh,
what,
man.
after watching this episode, I was like, man, Star Wars is not a kid show.
No, it's not. If
It
anything,
is-
Andor proved that to me. That was a bit too much for it was a bit too much for me. And this episode was getting there too.
Man, the Bad Batch is really, I mean, it's parental guidance for sure. I mean,
Mhm.
this was really heavy. But I know that there's got to be a lot more interpretations and different ways of looking at everything that we saw in this episode. So I would love to hear from our listeners. If you had some thoughts, some feedback that you'd like to share with us on this episode or anything Star Wars, send us your questions, your comments. Everything is welcome. You can email us at starwars@sqpn.com. You can also find StarQuest on Facebook at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia. Leave a comment there. You can find us on YouTube as well. Leave a comment or simply tweet us at SQPN. And another way that you can help is by telling anyone else you know to subscribe to Secrets of Star Wars. We will be continuing and finishing the Bad Batch Season 2, and then we'll get right into Star Wars Visions, which I know some of you are already dipping your toes into, and that is very exciting. So we will be covering it all on Secrets of Star Wars. You can find us in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, basically wherever you can find podcasts. And you can learn more about our show and see previous episodes at sqpn.com/Star Wars. All right, so be sure to give us a rating, give us a review, help us to know what we're doing well and how we can continue to help people who are interested in Star Wars to find Secrets of Star Wars. Next week, we will be going on a trip to Pabu, so come along with us as we discuss Season 2, Episode 13 of The Bad Batch. And honestly, who doesn't want a tropical getaway these days?
Yes, please.
So, Ryan Nafziger, it was great to have you back. Thank you so much for joining me in the Secrets of Star Wars.
Enjoyed every minute of it.
And once again, I am the one in the middle, the Bendu, Angela Sealana. Thank you for listening to the Secrets of Star Wars on StarQuest.
Here's another show on the StarQuest network you're sure to enjoy. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Find the show wherever fine podcasts are found or at sqpn.com/mysterious.